Okay.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Humans and Wildlife Show. My name's Georgia Auteri. With me today, as always, is my co host, Dr. Christian Sase. Christian, what are we going to talk about today?
Actually, it's exciting. I mean, we are going to go and look at new species. This was so exciting. You may remember a few weeks ago when Georgia and I were showing you this one Zoom about all these many species. And today we're actually going to talk with someone, and
The
we've
one
had
zoom
him
of the
for.
tree of life,
Yeah, the
yeah.
tree of life. That's that exactly. The one Zoom, the tree of life. That's right. And today we're going to talk to someone, actually, an entomologist, and he's going to tell us about what it's like to discover new species. So, without further ado, let's get Ricardo on.
Yeah, with us today we have, Dr. Ricardo Marino-Perez. And Ricardo, you're currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan, studies insects, and you specifically study grasshoppers. And not only do you study them, but you've actually discovered and named new species of grasshoppers, which is so exciting. So maybe just to start, Ricardo, why grasshoppers?
Well, it's interesting because I was studying my undergrad with a true box, and then I was studying my master's also with true box. But then uh, one day I received an email that two Italian colleagues were looking for some colleague in Mexico to help them to collect grasshoppers in Mexico. They need someone from the country to help them collect and a colleague to collaborate, and then just send them the email and they accept me, and then I start with them and I like them a lot. And in fact, in that very first expedition, I found or we found a new species, and for me it was super cool to find a
Yeah,
new.
I actually, as I was looking back through the list of scientific papers that you're an author on, I saw that you've been a co author on multiple papers describing new species. So, do you know how many species you've helped describe?
Probably five for of true box, five.
Okay.
One of protozoans that is very cool too. I can quickly find a picture of that. And of grasshoppers, probably like 20, 25 species.
Wow. So that's like a lot. That's a lot of different species. And so about 25 species of grasshoppers. Incredible. Um, and you're throwing out a lot of names like true bugs and grasshoppers. These are, different groups of insects.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, Christian, maybe we should orient ourselves on the tree of life to get
Yes,
started.
I just have to
See.
throw in some questions. I think, Ricardo, this is
Oh, yeah.
absolutely marvelous. I just see gentleman goes with a very relevant question here. By the way, hi from all of us to all our viewers. Thank you so much for participating. So, gentleman goes comes with a great question. I wonder who gets the name of the new species. Did Manu get the name of the new species? He wants to know: Are you famous now? What? How does it work?
Yeah.
Well,
So I guess we could do a little bit of a jump forward. So, Ricardo, you have named two species now, right? Why did you get to be the one to name them?
are you referring as the if I'm a first author and I name them,
Yeah, I
or
mean, people don't know. Yeah, they don't
Yeah.
know necessarily. Like, why do you get to be the first author? Or like, what? Why are you the primary person? Yeah,
it,
what
it,
did you do?
it is cool because usually in science these days we don't work alone. So we usually, for instance, when we're in the field,
Mm-hmm.
we are three or
Yes.
four of us collecting.
Yeah.
So exactly deciding who find it first or not, it is tricky because sometimes we separate in the field and then we return and the three of us have the new species.
Yes.
But we cannot decide, hey, I collected at 1 p.m. and you at 1 5 p.m. So it's mine. So that's the reason that sometimes we are co-authors. And
Yes.
uh, of course, the first step is we base in our expertise. We are thinking is new species.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean it's new. Is we consider based in our knowledge that is potentially new. We take pictures and collect them, but then there is another second part of the job that is go back to the laboratory and check. against all the previous closest species. And sometimes it's sad that we, not sad, but it's how science works. Sometimes we spend, I don't know, 2 3 days taking pictures, extracting the genitalia that is very helpful to determine if it's new or not. And at the end, it's like, no, this was already described 40 years ago, so it's not new, it's this species. But other times, after we compare, we just determine these specimens uh, don't belong to any or the given names that are around. So this is a new species, and that's when we decide to describe them. And one cool and important thing is to name the species, and then
Right. Okay.
to put the names, used to put names that refer to something about the animal or the
Mm-hmm.
plant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, something, for instance, a species of grasshopper is called Melanoplus mexicanus, and with that name, you understand that it's from Mexico, and things like that. There are species of plants or something that say Mississippiensis, or plants from here, from Michigan, Michigensis. So that was one part. Other times, you decide to dedicate the species after someone for different reasons. And at the beginning, you
Mm-hmm.
dedicated after Charles Darwin or after someone famous, but famous because famous in the field of biology. But now these days is also common to dedicate it to whatever you want just for fun. And as long as you follow the rules,
Ah, okay.
you can dedicate them to Lady Gaga. They dedicate this fern to Lady Gaga, and it's cool because sometimes you just dedicate it just because, and other times because that, for instance, for the Lady Gaga, that it was to a fern, because a part of the fern looks or reminds the author something about a Lady Gaga dress. So
Sure.
that's a valid reason. There is no impediment in
Okay.
the rules to dedicate the species.
Okay.
That makes sense. And so I would just want to highlight real quick,
Mm.
Ricardo touched on so many different things, and I have
Yes.
so many questions now to ask him, follow-up questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat as well. And so the takeaway from what you just described that I'm getting is you're out there in the wilderness finding grasshoppers, and basically you find the new species, you're the one who gets to name it. Maybe you have to negotiate with your friend, like, oh, we both found the same new species, but like you named the last one, so I'm going to name this one. Whatever. Hopefully, you've never ended any friendships over who gets to name the species. But but the person, whoever gets to name it, whoever discovered it, you have a lot of leeway. You can name it after a family member, a celebrity. You can give some that you can give it a name based on how it looks. That is the short answer to Gentleman Ghost's questions. But it did not escape my notice that you also mentioned the genitalia of the grasshoppers, which is apparently very important in all of this. I'm going to follow up on that. Um, and I know that you've also traveled to a lot of cool places in your pursuit of describing grasshoppers and different species and how they evolve. But for now, we have the tree of life up.
Exactly. Let's jump into
Yeah.
this now because this is this exciting one zoom tree that has 2.2 million species on there right now. So what I've done is I've zoomed in. Oh gosh, and now here goes my bad knowledge already. Acrididea, is that right, Ricardo? So what are we looking at here? Well, what is this name that we're looking at here?
Well, in general, this group is the one that consists of the common uh, animals, common
Uh huh.
insects known as grasshoppers.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the name. We have common names. I've been talking about butterflies,
Mm-hmm.
beetles, birds, mammals, but all of them have a more formal name,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a name that groups those. And as you are going to show in the tree, imagine
Yes.
that it's a box full of boxes, and each of those boxes have more boxes. It's just a way to organize everything. As you organize your
That's right.
clothes
Yes.
in your drawers is exactly like that. So one of the drawers that contains all the common grasshoppers is called like that.
Right.
Yeah,
And
and
okay,
Christian, can
sorry.
we do the zoom out and then zoom in real quick?
Exact.
Can you zoom all the way out? Because then we
I
can see
will,
what we're
and I'm just
doing.
going to, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy this name so that I can remember this, Georgia. And 1 second, I will go
Yeah, this
and
is copying the name
so
from
so
one
that
of Ricardo's
I can zoom
papers.
out, of course. So the question is, how do we actually zoom out? 1 sec. Zoom out is here.
I think
Okay,
you
here
just
we
have to
go.
scroll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to zoom all the way out more and more and more so you can see where we're coming from. There were the insects, by the way. It's about, what are they, about 1 million insect species, Ricardo, something like that, right?
Probably describe, but
Probably.
it probably could go depending the different researchers, but
Hmm.
they can have probably 30 million. Is still a lot of undescribed
Wow.
species.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to put one of these here, Pleiades in there. Is that correct? The
Yeah.
let's try that one. Is that a species or what is it? It's
That's the genus name.
genus. Thank you. Genus.
And
Okay.
you touch an
Okay.
important
Here
point
we go.
because
Uh-huh.
uh, as you go, you are going, as we were talking about boxes inside boxes, we are moving towards the tree of life
Mm-hmm.
until we reach the genus Pedies, and that
Pleiades.
genus includes different species. For the people that don't know about the
There
scientific
we are.
names,
Yeah.
any species,
Uh-huh.
even our name is Homo sapiens or Homo
Mm-hmm.
sapiens sapiens, depending how they refer it. The typical name for any given species has two or three parts. The thing that you mentioned, Pedies, is the first name, is the genus name. But
Okay.
all the species after the genus, you have the other one. For instance, I'd say Pedies has 13 species.
Mm-hmm.
All the species are Pedies something, Pedies A, Pedies B,
Right.
Pedies C. That's how a name is goes. For instance, the dog is Canis familiaris,
Uh-huh.
the cat, I don't know, I think it's Felis domesticus, something like
Uh-huh.
that. So all organisms have two names, or better
Yeah.
say, have one name that is composed like we have, no, a first name and last name, something like that.
Yeah, and we have a kind of relevant comment from Frankman who says, I guess it's also not easy to decide if it's just a variant of a known thing, right? So there's also sometimes subspecies names, right?
And exactly, and because it's boxes inside boxes, you can decide to classify your blouses of t-shirts as three or four types, or maybe for other person is seven. So you are right, and because all of them are branches, you decide. And I mean, in this hypothetical tree of life, you decide where to cut or where is called a branch or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that is really cool because sometimes it turns out there is another colleague that thinks that you have three species, not just one species with three populations.
Mm.
And who is correct? The populations exist, the specimens are there. It's just that in my mind, I have a hypothesis that is just one thing in my mind, but for my colleague, there are three things.
Right.
And both of us are kind of correct because we are talking about, let's say, three branches.
Mm-hmm.
And I just decide that those three branches are small enough and they are just part of one species, but the others say no, there are three. So that's sometimes a lot of variability, and sometimes there are not fights, but sometimes there is no consensus. And for some people, they treat something, for instance, giraffes. I think recently they say no, it's not just one species; it's like seven species. So it's tricky because there is no correct way to exactly decide when you are talking about one or not or more species.
Yeah, and we will perhaps we'll get into this a bit more later when we talk about the grasshopper genitalia, because that's an important part of species compatibility. Is if you interbreed, and your genitals have a lot to do with whether or not you're able to interbreed, especially
Hmm.
for insects, as we'll learn. But it looks like Christian has pulled up a picture of.
Yes.
Are these some of the species you described?
Yes, the A and B is one species, Lalancia fraile, and the C and D is another species of the genus
Beautiful.
Pericia. And
Incredible.
interesting, interesting. A and B is one species. A is the adult, and B is the juvenile.
Oh, really? That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's the juvenile, and of course, well, I know because the wings are small, and you can see two wings
Wow.
comparing to the A, where you just can see one wing. Yes, one wing. So A and B are the same species, and C and D are other species, but from a different genus.
Oh.
However, as we were talking about this when you do the zoom in, the two species, both A and B and C and D, the two species belongs to the same bigger branch that is called a tribe, dactylotine. Doesn't matter the name, but you can see that they look alike, but they are not exactly the same. And that's
Right.
what we face in the field. And you don't need to be an entomologist. You quickly see, okay, A and C, eh, I mean, both are grasshoppers. You can see the legs, you can see the wings that are small, that are kind of reticulate, but they don't exactly look the same, and they are not the same. There are different species, so that's something that we face. Uh, and these guys are really cool because maybe you imagine that I need to travel super far and take a I don't know, walk for 5 hours to find them. No, these are found next to the road. We are lucky because grasshoppers,
Really?
as the name say, they like grasses, and it's very common that when you cut in the mountains to create a road, the things that the typical plants that just grow next to the road are grasses. So it's very common to find grasshoppers next to the road. So when we took these pictures,
Uh-huh.
our car was probably 2 meters away from us.
And
Sometimes we are just parking the car and we can see the grasshoppers jump. So that's a very cool thing or a easy thing for us because
uh-huh.
other people that study different systems, they need really to travel to the middle
That's
of the
true.
Amazonian forest or to the forest in Papua New Guinea or I don't know. For our case, it's relatively easy due to the nature
Uh,
of these guys. So even recently in Los Angeles, in yards, in backyards of people, they find new species of insects. So don't you think that the new species are super far or in very remote places? Sometimes there are just in the backyards that you haven't looked for them.
well,
That's
Ricardo,
so
this oh,
cool.
sorry, but this begs so many questions from me as someone who doesn't know. First of all, I mean these colors are absolutely exquisite. I mean, me as a photographer just sees absolute joy here. You know, I have so many questions there just looking at this. Why do you think nature is inventing so many colors here? That's one thing. And the other thing is, you were talking about different species here, which is very interesting. Are there such a thing as subspecies in grasshoppers too, as we find in salmon or other fish or so? Or,
Yes,
yeah.
there are. It's valid. There is this book. This is the Code of Zoological Nomenclature. I don't know where is the. This
Yes?
is a book that
Okay.
has all the rules. Here is a book full of rules
Okay.
regarding exactly all of these things. And one of the rules is that the code allows to have subspecies. It's very it's interesting. It's tricky because when do you decide when it's subspecies and it's
I
not
don't know.
enough to be a species? That's up to the author. So that can create or no problems. Sometimes there are jokes like, "Oh, you are not brave enough to name it a species, so you just say it's subspecies." But
Really?
at least you are trying to say something, and the same happens to the next level, the genus level. In beetles, for example, there are a lot of sub genera. So you it's still in the box, but you kind of create a middle box that you still are not super sure to divide it, but you just kind of say it maybe to provoke reaction among other researchers to study them there, and turns out it exists or turns out it was not true. So but it's valid. In the rules, it's a code full of rules. In the rules, it's allowed to have that. And as you mentioned, in fishes happens a lot. In plants, well, because now there is another thing called domestication. In plants now they have varieties that they call and hybrids, and
Hmm.
all of those things happen. But at the end, this led us to the question that Georgia has. The most important is that in grasshoppers we use genitalia to separate them because we are
Okay.
talking about compatibility among them. We are saying this thing is a new
Hmm.
species, is that we are saying that they can interbreed between them.
Yeah, I remember you telling me a funny story about once you were at the airport and you were like talking on the phone to someone uh, back at the lab, and you had put your box of you'd left your box of genitalia somewhere, and you were like talking and talking about you're like, no, leave the genitalia on the table, and the other people sitting near you at the airport are like,
Yes, and one day in the laboratory, the genitalia, when we photograph the genitalia, we need to put them in a solution of it's a brand of here, KJJK, something like that. It's
Uh-huh.
a lubricant.
Uh-huh.
oh yeah, like KY jelly or something
Something
like
like
that.
that. It's a lubricant that we use because it's kind of viscous enough to put the genitalia there, like the pictures that are passing there. All those
Okay,
pictures of the genitalia,
I was just hoping I'm getting the right ones. One second.
well,
You're like Christian's like, I haven't ever scrolled around looking for pictures
all
of
of those,
genitalia of grasshopper before, but I
all of
think this is
those,
them.
I don't
Yeah,
all of
this is
know.
those
the genitalia, right?
all of those cool things that look like
Uh-huh. Let me
spatial
go to the
sort
top
of
again.
space aircraft, all of them
Hmm.
are from the grasshoppers, and
Okay.
all those genitalia are put in this lubricant so they can hold there and you can take the picture. So
Uh-huh.
Mm,
sometimes it's hard for us to try to demonstrate to people from the university that we need to order
Uh-huh.
lubricant for research
yeah.
purposes. They don't understand it, but it's for this. It
Wow.
looks like they are floating, but there are no floating. There are just, well, they are not in air. They are sitting in the lubricant so we can take the pictures.
Yeah, and to be clear, like the reason genitalia are
Uh-huh.
particularly species specific in insects oftentimes is that insects are sclerotized, right? They have a hard
Hmm.
exoskeleton.
Hmm.
And so there is a very precise shape that the
Exactly, like
genitalia have to be so that they match and can fit together. It's often described as like a lock and key
exactly. It's
mechanism.
like you
So,
need you need
yeah.
a key to open the door of your house, and the neighbor needs another key to open a similar door. But if it's not exactly the key, you cannot enter. It's exactly the same that happens here.
Open the
O-
door to
Of course,
Pleasure Town.
here all the interesting question starts because here in my system in grasshoppers we are assuming of male female,
Right.
but then there are other uh, the term the academic, the scientific term is parthenogenetic,
Okay.
but it means in clear terms it means that sometimes females just lay eggs in for instance in lizards they lay eggs, and the eggs when they hatch there are only females, and those females can have more females, they don't need a male.
Really?
So
Okay.
in those cases this assumption of lock and key
Hmm.
doesn't accommodate. So that's an important thing, and the people that study this, we
Hmm.
always fight about the what species concept you use, and there are tons of species concepts. Here we are using more this biological species concept that is based on there are males and females that can reproduce, but other set of colleagues use different concepts. And if you ask me which is the best to use, people use the one that fits the best for their research, because people that study fossils they cannot figure it out if that female belongs to the other female. There are just bones, no? So
Yeah.
it's tricky.
Yeah,
These genitalia, they look like just something out of this world from somewhere
yeah, just to
else.
give people a scale, I'm just seeing here this 250 microns. So what you're talking about, if you talk about this distance here, it's about 1 millimeter, right?
Hmm.
That's really small, right? So that's a hundredth of a centimeter, and oh gosh, convert that to inch. It's like it's
I
it's very
Yeah.
small.
I happy
And
that you are converting because I have to deal with your inches all the
No, not
time
with
and
mine. I'm Canadian.
uh,
Okay,
uh,
don't.
yeah, just my inches.
ounces and pounds and
Yeah.
gallons and
Yeah.
so
Well, so but
they are really small indeed, and this is a cool
yeah.
thing because maybe in the field we feel they are different or not,
Hmm.
but we really need to extract the genitalia to see the difference.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so to be
Sometimes,
clear, like when you're part of your responsibility of as someone describing a new species, you don't just get to say, "Hey, everyone, guess what? Here's the name." You have to say you have to really thoroughly describe the species, show pictures of this is what their genitalia look like, this is the type of habitat. That way, other people can go and identify the species as well. So it's a privilege that comes with a lot of responsibilities to name a species.
and speaking about responsibility, not in insects, but for instance, there is a black market for reptiles in the world. You know, they
Yes.
like
Yes.
lizards and things like that. So the last bad thing that is happening is that if someone describes a new species of lizard, usually you need to provide the
Oh, I
most
see.
accurate place. But then
Right.
the other people that I don't know how they call them, the ones that just illegal collectors,
Hmm.
they go and because it's a new species
Right.
in the black market, it can reach fantastic amounts of money. So now, in grasshoppers is not the problem, but in a different cool or
Hmm.
different
Hmm.
systems that have a lot of market for pets, such as
Hmm.
the lizards, now the authors just provide a kind of vague description of where it was found, exactly to avoid this negative thing. So you are mentioned, Georgia, a very interesting thing. Is a lot of responsibility
Wow.
because at the same time, sometimes you find new species, I don't know, in a small piece of land that is about to be converted for a
Hmm.
building or for crops or something. And then you have the tools to speak with the stakeholders to say, hey, this species is just found
Hmm.
in this particular part. So we need to stop the conversion of the land.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting tool that you can use in the positive, or the people from the black markets can take it into the negative. So,
Right.
and it's an important thing. Species are just hypotheses in our minds.
Uh huh.
Maybe I'd say this here, hey, here are five new species.
Hmm.
Maybe in 5 years, even myself or another colleague says, hey, I use more evidence. I don't know, DNA evidence more than the genitalia.
Hmm.
I use other type of data, and it turns out they were not five. They were just one, or the opposite. They were 20. So you were wrong, and I am not going to be angry. On the contrary, I am happy because that's how science works. If you have more evidence that can explain better what we are looking, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and Ricardo, just to jump
Hmm.
back a little bit, because you mentioned like some of these new species, you found them just by the side of the road. That's by the side of the road in Mexico, correct?
In Mexico, yeah, no. If I go outside here, I'm not going to find only snow.
But I mean, so just yeah, we have a question about your background again. So
Yeah.
like right now, you're in Michigan.
I'm in
Unfortunately,
Michigan.
with me in the United States, it's cold,
Unfortunately,
it's cloudy,
there he is.
it's
That's his
miserable.
background.
Yeah, but you're from Mexico originally. You've described several species, from, a lot of species from Mexico, and do a lot of field work in Mexico. But you've also traveled many other places too. So can you tell us about some of the other places you've traveled and done field work on your grasshopper hunting?
We have collect grasshoppers in South Africa,
Hmm.
Namibia, Costa Rica,
Wow.
Dominican Republic. I have collect also grasshoppers in Italy, but there are not some new species. But the great biodiversity, the great
Hmm.
diversity is particularly now in places with a lot of changes in altitude, mountain places. One would think that the great majority of diversity is in the rainforest, and it's correct. There are a lot of species in the rainforest, but for instance, now we are focusing more in mountain systems.
Hmm.
And even in US, for these small grasshoppers in the areas of Colorado, Utah, Idaho, all those places that are mountain systems, that's where are the new species.
Very interesting. Although I do seem to recall, I think when it was when you got back from a recent collecting trip, maybe your one to South Africa, where you said you found what you think is probably a new species of grasshopper, but it was in the forest. You made kind of a joke like, "Oh, normally we think of like new species of grasshopper in the grassy areas, but this one is in the trees." So,
Exactly, and in South Africa, a lot of these new species are in the forest, in the leaf litter, where you are not expecting them, and that's the reason they
Right.
are not rare. Is
Hmm.
that we were not expecting grasshoppers that are more associated to uh, grass areas, grassland areas, in the leaf litter in the forest, but they were there.
yeah, Christian has up some web pages here and stuff.
Exactly. This is the thing that a lot of us do. Like
Mhm.
we can name a species after something. And that is an interesting thing because then you get attention. And this attention, of depending how you handle it, but it could be positive because then you can get more funding for your research.
Hmm.
And as you can
Yes.
see, for instance, in this, they describe here a beetle in the name of Darth Vader, but here it's interesting. They describe it because the insect reminds the author of the Darth
Right.
uh, Vader. So that's a cool thing. It's not just I describe it because I describe it. It's I describe it because it reminds me something.
Yes.
We have a comment from Gentleman Ghost
Hmm.
earlier. He said, "If you find a good-looking, dark-looking grasshopper, it should be called Gentleman Ghost grasshopper." So, just a thought to put out
That's a
there. I
good
know there's a
one.
couple other people in line to be named for you to name. Uh, yeah, Ricardo, who have you named your grasshopper species after?
Well, once I named one after my mom,
Of course, was that the
and
first one?
it's no, it's this Pedis is interesting. We name it Pedis Andrea, the one we described, but it's cool. We name it after one colleague that was with us collecting the species.
Ah,
So sometimes it's quite common. It's tricky because sometimes you say to the person in the field, "Hey, we can describe it together," or if you don't participate in the description, but because you collect them, I dedicate the species to you.
oh, so are you not allowed? Are you not? Is it like bad form to name it after yourself or one of the other
Is
co-authors?
as any rule in other fields, is not forbidden per se, but is of bad taste. You never
Oh.
self-dedicate a species. You should not.
Big faux pas, I guess. I see.
So, and there are a lot of endless rules. For instance, in one, I saw that in one of the links they dedicate a species to the President Obama.
Uh-huh.
When you dedicate a species, for instance, and it's a male, the last letter should be the I. It should be Obama. When you dedicate to a female, it needs to end in a e, and so on. So it depending the
Oh.
person. There are endless rules. Those is the less of the things, but those rules are important when you dedicate the names.
Fascinating.
Technically, as a courtesy, you should ask first to the person to be honored if they accept the species, because maybe they say no, I don't think I deserve that. But a lot of times it's impossible to call Lady Gaga and say, do you want to? So a lot of times you just jump that and you just dedicate it.
You're getting a fern named after you whether you like it or not. It was a
And if
fern that someone named after her, right?
and if you
Fern,
show the
that's right.
link of Lady Gaga, you can see why they dedicated to Lady Gaga, because it has it's a fern like that. It's a fern
Oh,
that certain
Ah.
structure of the fern
Right.
looks like a dress of Gaga, and that's how they dedicate it.
Right.
And it's
Right.
cool. I mean, it's cool.
Yeah.
Is is allowed,
Hmm.
and you get attention, and it's an honor. Charles Darwin has endless species dedicated after him.
Mm.
The same David
True.
Attenborough, that maybe a lot of you have heard that participate in a lot of documentals for the
Hmm.
BBC. He has a lot of species named after him, so that's quite a thing.
That makes sense. So when you're naming these species, and you said like you think you have something new, but then you have to go and like do the research. You have to check, right? So I think Christian, we had some pictures of like um,
Yeah.
museum specimens
Yes, of
of
course. Here we go.
grasshoppers. Yeah, like do you go and look at other museum specimens, or are you reading and looking at other pictures
Yes,
too?
and this is a cool picture, and this is a picture from here, from the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology. Here, there are probably, I don't know, like 25, 30 new species
Hmm.
that I'm planning to describe. I'm
Wow.
in the process of describing them, and there are like that in those boxes. It's cool. I mean, it's cool because they are new, but it's not as cool as the other type that when you find them alive, jumping,
Sure.
and
So these
however, this is super cool because it's the importance of the museums of natural history.
Yeah, so to be clear, these are specimens you I know you work a lot here in the museum. You were just like rummaging around through all these boxes of grasshoppers and you saw these and you were like, "Wait, someone collected this years ago.
Hmm.
Didn't know what it was. Maybe they identified it as a wrong species or something, but you're like, I actually think that this is something new." So
Exactly.
you don't necessarily even have to go to South Africa and all these places yourself. You can also dig around in the museum and find new things. I think that's so cool.
Well, it's cool, but you don't have the opportunity to go. So it's cool and sad at the same time. But it's cool. It's cool because there are many colleagues that have described hundreds of species and they have never been to those places.
Right.
They just find them in the museum, but it's really cool.
It is, yeah.
And
Yeah.
here, the Museum of Michigan has the second best collection for grasshoppers in the entire continent. So here there are material that has been collected for decades, and all this material that is in the picture is from Mexico. So what is cool is that I checked this material that was collected in 1950s, 60s, and now I return because as you maybe you can or cannot see, but all the specimens that you saw in those boxes have labels. In those labels, you basically say it was collected 3 kilometers north of Mexico City, something like that. So with that, you can return, and it's very cool that many times we have returned to these old localities, and the grasshoppers are there. So it's
So
really
man.
cool because we have new ones.
Yeah.
Other times it's really sad because you just go there and it's just a new shopping mall that is built
Yeah,
there. It's gone.
Ricardo, just that's a really important thing. You talk about new shopping malls, and I saw in one of the papers you are talking about the importance of the maintaining the diversity of the species and so on. Could you maybe allude a bit more about? Do you have any estimate of how many species of grasshoppers there may have been lost, and also maybe to tell people what the importance of grasshoppers actually are?
Yes, the importance is like mosquitoes, no? If you talk about mosquitoes, maybe you are just thinking, they
Hmm.
transmit uh, Zika virus and tons of those things. And maybe when you talk about grasshoppers, you are just thinking in locusts and
Hmm.
that they are pests and they are bad. Some of them can be plague, but it's not their fault. It's our fault because we have monocultures, and if we
Of
just
course.
happen to plant the
Yeah.
plants that they like, well, of course they grow, but it's not even their fault. But a lot of them are not pests, and there are herbivores because they feed on grasses, and then there are the food for spiders, for lizards, for
Hmm.
birds. So there are part of a chain of the how do you call the food chain.
Hmm.
So there are a key component of that. And for instance, in Mexico currently there are 1,000 species, kind of 1,000 species described, and we think there are at least the double of those that we haven't found.
Ricardo, speaking of conservation, like we have a question, maybe a dumb question, but is there a research rich area of Mexico, Baja, Chiapas area? Like, And kind of hand in hand in with that, are there certain places or habitats that you think are really important to protect for grasshoppers or other insects?
Well, Baja California is a fantastic place, and fortunately or luckily, due to political and historical reasons, is very isolated. It has a very low population. So the Mexican government, the biggest conservation areas are in Baja California Peninsula because there is nothing to. I mean, there are no people to deal with. Other important areas of conservation in Oaxaca and Chiapas, they are important to conserve, but the issue is that there is a lot of people that already lives there. So how you deal to tell them, hey, there is a new species, but you need to don't touch the the habitat, but they need to cut it to plant coffee or other things. So it's a back and forth negotiation to decide what to preserve or not. As a biologist, we would like to preserve all, but we understand that is not possible. But however, it's really cool. I just get a International Union of Conservation of Nature grant to study some very endemic grasshoppers in Oaxaca and Chiapas, and it's really cool because last December I just visit the localities, and the people there know, because it's a very rich area, these mountain areas in Oaxaca, they know that there are also a lot of endemic plants, endemic birds, lizards, and now they organize and say, instead of cut and plant coffee or other stuff, let's conserve this in a more ecotouristic way. And one of the plans that I'm going to do the next July is go and talk to them about these endemic grasshoppers that they just happen to be only there, provide them with pictures, help them to identify them. So now they have more tools to preserve and organize more of these tours. So that's an important thing. And when the people that live in these areas are very nice and intelligent people, and once they get the information, they are happy to preserve the areas.
Oh yeah, this is a picture of this is someone else you named a species after, right?
Yes,
Who is
this
this?
species that is the one that it was shown first in as an A and B,
Uh-huh.
the Lila Downs fraile, we dedicated after Lila Downs, that is a singer and composer that is from Mexico, and this species was found in Oaxaca State. She is from Oaxaca State.
Mm.
Also, she's a singer that promotes the diversity in Mexico, both in languages and culture.
Wow.
So she
Okay.
also always wear with these different colors, bright colors. So it reminds us, when we found the species, remind us of her uh, colors, her life, and we decide to dedicate after her. And was really cool because uh, she invited us to a concert, and then in that concert we exchanged words. We gave her that frame with the pictures of the species, and it was a really cool thing.
Beautiful.
For Yes,
Beautiful,
and
really.
yeah, it's a cool thing that we did.
Yeah, that must be wonderful to find someone who reminds you of the species you described, both
This is the
in their
concert.
coloration. Yeah, but
This
she
is
also
very
like
unusual,
aligns.
this picture.
Yeah,
This-
this is the concert of Lila Downs. Was in Austin, Texas, probably 2015 or 16.
uh-huh.
And because she was so honored that we described and we named a species after her, she
Oh,
put some pictures of the grasshoppers in the stage. So that
yeah.
was a really cool thing. And
Unreal.
of course, we ask for permission
Hmm.
Mm.
because maybe there's. So we contact her and say, "Hey, Lila Downs, we have this grasshopper. We want to dedicate this for these reasons,"
Mm.
and she accept.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like your goals as biologists, as people interested in conservation, are really in line with a lot of her values too, right? In terms of like
Exactly,
conserving
because it's,
diversity of
it's
yeah.
typical. I'm not going to name politics in this, but it is typical that some people describe moth or something with very miniature genitalia and decide to dedicate it after a politician just
Yeah.
for the sake of that this person hates this politician. That's
Mm.
bad taste. Is not forbidden, but of
Yeah.
course, if you contact the person and you say, "I'm going to dedicate because of this," is so as always, no, you can use it in a positive way,
Mm. That's right.
dedicate it because
That's
it
right.
deserves it, or just to make fun of.
Yeah,
I think
that's not.
I
That,
think Linnaeus. I'm not sure if this is true, but I think
mm.
Linnaeus or someone named a toad after Buffon because
Oh,
they I think they can have an argument, and the name of the toad is Buffo something. So sometimes there are these ways of joke among the researchers.
yeah, it seems like if you do it as kind of a collegial joke, it's one thing, but it does kind of also devalue the species in a way, right? Because you're like, oh, the species' whole name is just going to be to make fun of some person I don't like. Like,
Yes, but sometimes it's just the argument. Uh, Here, for instance, in A, this was that's a cool species. It's the first new species that we found when I joined these Italian colleagues. We were in Oaxaca precisely,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just sitting there. And I remember I saw it first, and but I was starting with grasshoppers. For me, it was another grasshopper, and I collected, and then I show it to my colleague Paolo Fontana from Italy, and he said this is new because he knows more about the fauna. And he immediately asked me, "Where did you find it?" And I just say, "Oh, just there." And we go there and we check in which plant they were because sometimes they prefer to stay in certain plants. And we look for more plants, and effectively they were there. And it was a really cool. And the name of this species is Oaxaca colorata. We name it after the state because it's Oaxaca, and colorata because the colors. So it was a really cool thing to say.
Yeah,
And
Ricardo, that's one thing that interests me. Maybe you forgot to answer, but talk a bit about the colors of grasshoppers. What is the where do you, what purpose do you see, if any?
there are multiple
Okay.
purposes. Some of these, for instance, you could think, oh, it's colorful, so maybe
Mm-hmm.
is to attract females.
Yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm.
a possibility. So
Mm-hmm.
they can recognize in this world of greens. It's impossible to
Mm-hmm.
imagine in a forest, tropical forest or cloud forest. It's full of green, full of flower.
Mm-hmm.
How do you recognize? So sometimes these patterns, these colors, are used so the females can recognize
Mm-hmm.
the males and vice versa. Other times, the color means that they are toxic because they feed on toxic plants. So
Oh, I
basically,
see.
the color, that's a posematism, that's a term to say a warning coloration. Don't eat me because I taste awful. Other times, they are super colorful, but for instance, in B, if you pay attention, in B, it has two lines that
Mm-hmm.
runs from the eyes to the back part.
Mm-hmm.
Those lines, quite clear lines,
Mm-hmm.
uh, here is clear because it's in the picture, but if you saw it from far,
Yes.
with those lines you break the pattern, and you it's confused now. So it's
Ah,
like
okay.
it's like a zebra, a
Mm-hmm.
zebra.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's another part. Maybe it's colorful or has certain patterns, but on the contrary, this pattern is cryptic and makes you disappear. In C, you can see in C this. This is not a grasshopper; it's a katydid. It's a sister group to grasshoppers. But in C, the katydid looks is brownish and is in the ground, so it confused
Yes.
with
Yes.
the ground.
Yes.
So that's another
Mm-hmm.
coloration, but on the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
In D, this species is the genus name is Arachnitus because looks like an arachnid, like an spider. And again,
Right.
the legs are so long that they
Wow.
just get confused with other parts of the grass. It's
That's
hard
a
to see.
grasshopper. I had no idea. That's incredible. Yes. Wow.
And things
yeah,
like
it's
that. So
turning into grass, it looks like.
Yeah.
so
Wow.
that's the reason of the colors.
Right.
Sometimes is to
Right.
it's like the typical, probably the people are familiar with the
Mm-hmm.
monarch butterfly, right? that
Yes, of
that has
course.
these colors, and is to warn the predators that they are toxic.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very good.
I don't know if there are questions of the public.
I I think there's no more questions right now. People are impressed by how many different places you've traveled to, um, and yeah, and just like I think excited by your research and seeing all these cool pictures.
I mean, I'm just curious, Ricardo, how many species of grasshoppers do you think are still undiscovered? I mean, this must go through your head, surely, right?
Yes, for instance, in Mexico, that is the region I know
Hmm.
more, is there are like 1,000 orthopterans already described. We are thinking in probably another 1,000 or 2,000. So probably we are just 33 to
Wow.
50% of the species. And it's a
Really?
good point what you mentioned. We should clarify that is a species new to science
Mhm.
because the species are there. And for instance, these species that we dedicate after the singer, Liladauncia, that's the first name. The second name is fraile, Liladauncia fraile, because fraile is a word in Spanish that means friar. Because in here in this part of the after the head, it looks like it has like a hood.
Hmm.
And the reason we name it after that is because when we collected, we were astonished that it was new, and the local people told us,
You.
"Oh yes, they are everywhere," and we call them frailes. So we say, I think if they call them frailes, we should reflect in the scientific name that these grasshoppers was known for hundreds of years for the local people. So we should emphasize is a species new to science.
I see.
Very
So
Yeah,
good.
it's a very important. And we have another colleague, Dr. Ote from Philadelphia, from Academy of Science of Philadelphia. This colleague has described tons of grasshoppers from Florida, from Mexico, and usually he names them after the indigenous people from the region.
Hmm.
So that's another way also to honor that is known uh, for the people for many, many time before, and that's a cool thing. How
yeah,
many new species? Probably both of you have seen, and the audience, probably you have seen new species. You just don't know that there are new to
right.
science.
To science. That's so well said. I never thought about it like this until today. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, Ricardo, do you ever, so how do you go about that? Like when you find a new species, do you just go to like local and or indigenous people and be like, "Do you know what this is?" Like do you call it something? Like is there some best practices for doing that?
Yes, and also sometimes they know a lot because they live there, and they tell you, "Oh, there are more in this other place." So they help us to find them. They are happy. These recent years, this application iNaturalist is so cool because you can take pictures and upload them. And we have found new species after pictures that we saw and say, oh, let's go and visit the locality. We should not describe only based on a picture. And it has been a debate that have been people that start to describe the species based on pictures that they saw in iNaturalist or Flickr. You should have the specimen because it's important to have a voucher to compare when someone wants to study them there. But these applications are really cool because sometimes a lot of the people, for instance, is very common, are bird watchers. And it's
Yes.
very, very typical that because they are just there and they just saw something, they take the picture and upload it with fantastic data. You
Isn't
know,
that
the time of
incredible?
the day. And then sometimes we just contact them. And a colleague from Croatia was able to contact bird watchers in Australia about a potential new grasshoppers. They returned, they collected, they sent it to Croatia, and now they describe it properly as a new species. So these new applications have a tremendous potential about that. And
Interesting.
also, I
Uh-huh.
I want to mention that in insects is relatively easy to describe new species. Maybe Georgia that study mammals, describing a new species of mammal is not super easy. Not because you are not looking, it's because they are kind of already uh, have reached Uh,
There are not many mammals compared to how many different species of insects there are. They tend to be bigger. People notice them
Hmm.
more. I've already named them.
and usually, and the same happen with birds. Sometimes, if nowadays someone describe a new species of mammal or bird, it's not exactly because they find it. It's because doing an analysis, for instance, using DNA,
Hmm.
they saw that some that was considered to be a species, it turns out they were two different species, so they split a already known one. I'm not saying that's not valid, that's super important, but that's a
Yeah.
different way comparing to say I just find it.
I'm just
And
going to objectively say I think it's less exciting. Yeah.
yes, and another important thing that it was asked for me, a lot of these species are just have just a single record in a museum. So maybe I don't know, in Mexico, maybe about these 1,000 already described species, maybe for 100 of them they are already extinct because in the old days, I'm talking about the 1800s, things like that. They were collecting outside the city, but these days that city expanded, and right now is just bigger. So now I'm sure a lot of already described species are extinct, and the most sad is that others that are not even known to science are getting extinct just right now. So we will never know.
All right.
For the others, at least
Hmm.
at least we have information. So I don't know. It's not exactly. I mean, it's sad, but at least we have something. For the others, we will never know.
Yeah, that's really sobering. And it reminds me of another conservation link to describing species, which is that if you don't name it, you can't protect it, right? It's harder to get it listed as endangered or even provide, guidance on protecting it or whatever. So
Yes, that is
another,
correct. And I know in Florida, for instance, it was an issue of people that study snakes. Some researchers want to divide species in subspecies, and a lot of other colleagues say no, that maybe is not correct. But they say, hey, if we divide it by these subspecies, that is almost a population, because if we create a unique thing, a unique name, then we have more leverage to ask for the town, for the county, for money to funding this because it's a unique lineages so sometimes it's to play around, and at the end the colleagues say what we want is to preserve it. So that's it's could be complicated, but there are a lot of reasons sometimes to do the things.
so I think maybe we're just coming up to an hour. Maybe it's
Hmm.
time for Christian and I will each do a closing question. And audience members, if you have any final questions, last chance to ask them. Um, So I think my closing question is going to be, Ricardo, have you ever considered trying to marry this like species naming privilege with conservation and like try to do a fundraiser or something to be like, oh, like, vote using money for like which name you prefer or something like that. Has anyone done that? Is that bad form?
No, it's a clever form. In cucarachas someone did that, and basically like that, the person that gave me more money, I named the cucaracha after that person. It works. So it's a clever way. It's common that there are societies sometimes,
Right.
associations that provide the money. Sometimes you just name it after that. Hugh Hefner has a subspecies of rabbit, I think from Florida, because he provide money for the conservation or something, and then they name the subspecies after him. So
Wow.
that's because it's a is I mean, one thing is to name the species, another is properly describe it. Not probably the name is the less of the things, but also it could be used for these things that you say to raise money for that.
Yeah, for us, the public, the naming is the exciting part.
Exactly,
And
and it's,
Ricardo, for me, the closing question has to be, what is the most colorful grasshopper you've ever seen?
well, probably this Liladauncia fraile is super colorful, is
Okay,
super
the one
bright.
we just showed, was that the
The,
one?
the The one I show that we dedicate after the singer,
I think it
Once.
was one of the first four
the one
Christian.
that I
Okay, hang
say
on.
this is
Okay,
the
okay.
adult
ACB,
and
yeah.
this is the juvenile, is super colorful. Yes,
Mm,
that the A and B,
yeah,
those
yeah,
are
yeah.
super colorful,
Beautiful. Yeah.
and we are just showing there one adult and one
Yeah.
juvenile, but there were other specimens from the same locality with different varieties of, instead of yellowish was reddish or more orangish. So the combination is fantastic. Imagine you are just playing in Photoshop, moving the values of the colors of the intensity. It's so cool. So these are really cool. I study other grasshoppers in Africa that are also super colorful and fantastically beautiful. So, but yeah, this is one of the most colorful.
And we have one more question from Frankman that I think is very relevant. So Frankman, Ricardo is asking, how long does evolution take for something being far enough to be considered a new species? How long does that actually take? That's a great question.
How long it takes
Yes,
for
in evolution, really to form a new species.
the
That's,
illusion?
yeah. In
Yeah, like
evolution, yeah, yeah.
yeah, how long does it take a new species to evolve?
Yes, that's it. That's it. Yeah.
I think it could take uh, hundreds of, no, thousands of hundreds, I mean, a lot of years. And it's a very cool question because there are not speciating at the very same time all the species in the world. So sometimes it happens that we are just looking a potential pair of species that are just starting to separate due to a road, to a river, to a mountain. So in the genitalia they look alike, but probably they were or there are their fate is to be new species, but in thousands of hundreds of years, millions, well, not millions of years, but hundreds of years. So there is a gray area, and that's a lot of the things that the biologists are now studying. These gray areas of when there are already new species or when they can even return and still mix.
Yeah, because if
Incredible.
it takes so long, that means a lot of things are still in the process of maybe diverging into different species or
and
something.
this
Makes
and
sense.
this doesn't happen in our lifetime. The
No,
problem
no.
sometimes with us is our perception. It's like geology. When you talk about geology, we say geologically spoken, a blink of an eye in geology is millions of years. But in our case, Darwin, that was born many years ago, is finding the very same species that we are finding because there is not enough time for them to separate in
It's a
that
good point.
amount of our time. Basically, we are looking at a photograph of life, but imagine like a photograph of your family. Some are old, some are young, some are pregnant, other not. It's something like that.
That's so cool.
Very well
Well,
said. Yeah.
thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ricardo, for sharing all of your knowledge with us and your photos and your stories. If you liked hearing Ricardo talk, he was actually previously a guest on the show, so you can go back and watch the episode Eating Insects, where we interviewed both Ricardo and Lisa Betancourt about entomophagy, the practice of eating insects. So, yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much, Ricardo. That was so exciting, really, and the best part is all the learning. So thanks, and you have such in-depth knowledge. I enjoyed, and also there's so much passion, and I love people who are so passionate like you. So it's really wonderful. Thanks for being here. So Giorgio, just very quickly, we're gonna be back next week. Or no, we're not. Sorry.
You're going to be back next week.
I'm gonna be back next week. Yeah, that's right. So you're going to be absent, and yeah, next week. I thought we're not going to have the humans and wildlife show because I don't like doing that without Georgia. But instead, I'm going to start the new series, which is going to be called 68 Eagles. So it's all about the 68 eagle species, and we'll do one species at a time. So 68 series, and it's going to start a kickoff next Wednesday. So tune in then. 68 Eagles.